Hello, my name is Genesis Gonzalez.
Hi, I'm Hari, and we
We
are the
are
Environmental
Climate
Warriors.
Warriors. Today's topic is carbon footprint. Let's get into it. We've all heard the words climate change and global warming at least once or twice. In fact, these words are being used now more than ever, according to Google's nGraph Viewer tool that tracks word usage. But why is that? Well, a big reason is that these are issues that are hurting our planet as we speak. Many people around the globe are trying to advocate as much as possible to inspire action that can save our planet and species, which includes us as we are too in imminent danger. Most of the negative changes that the Earth is experiencing, studies have found, are human induced. In other words, human activities is directly affecting how the planet regulates temperature.
Because we live in a world that operates under the greenhouse effect, where heat absorbing gases known as greenhouse gases get trapped in the atmosphere, continuing to do activities that release an excessive amount of greenhouse gases only results in negative effects. Did you notice carbon dioxide is included? You might want to keep this in mind. Well, what are some examples of these negative effects? According to an article in myclimate.org and NASA's Global Climate Change Program, some direct and indirect consequences of climate change include rising maximum and minimum temperatures, rise in sea levels, higher oceanic temperatures and ocean acidification levels, increased wildfires, melting of ice sheets and glaciers, changes to precipitation patterns, more droughts and water shortages, natural disasters such as hurricanes will become more frequent and intense, and health risk crisis, loss of biodiversity, and so much more.
Now, after seeing all that, you might be feeling a little scared and helpless. But lucky for you, Hari and I are here to tell you how you can save the planet. Now, we will dive more in depth in the concept of carbon footprint and provide you with some ways you can help reduce your effects. When we talk about our own carbon footprint, we are talking about the amount of greenhouse gases, primarily CO2, that is released into the atmosphere by a particular human activity. In other words, your individual carbon footprint is an estimation of the total climate change impact of something you do or buy. Because carbon footprint is directly looking into our activities, it shows that we have the power to control how much carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalents we are emitting from day to day. Carbon footprint takes into account manufacturing to delivery to use. Hari, can you explain to us what are some examples that leave a carbon footprint?
Well, Genesis, first it is important to note that carbon footprint varies from person to person. The examples I will mention are averages of activities that emit the most CO2 per year based on US averages. Flying in a plane, 2,204 pounds. Turning on the lights, 1,579 pounds. Running the air conditioner, 1,904 pounds. Eating meat, 3,578 pounds. Using the dishwasher, 379 pounds. Drinking coffee, 50.6 pounds. Reading the newspaper, 2.5 pounds. Using the refrigerator, 2,000 pounds. Running the dryer, 227 pounds. Driving a car, 10,959 pounds.
Want to know two quick facts? The average is about 4 tons, about 8,800 pounds. And according to an article in nature.org, in order to avoid a 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures, the average footprint per year needs to be under 2 tons, or about 4,400 pounds, by the year 2050, which is half. Now, brace yourselves. We are going to analyze a few countries, starting with the US. Before we get into that, there are a few things you should know beforehand.
So we will be using a program called JMARS. JMARS stands for Java Mission Planning and Analysis for Remote Sensing. It is a geographic information system developed by the Arizona State University's Mars Spaceflight Facility to provide mission planning and data analysis tools for NASA scientists, instrument teams, as well as for the general public.
We will be looking at the Global Human Footprint Index as well as the Human Influence Index. Global Human Footprint Index represents the relative human influence in a specific area expressed as a percentage. 0 represents the least human influence, while 100 represents the most. The purpose of this index is to provide an updated map on anthropogenic impacts on the environment in a geographic projection.
The Human Influence Index demonstrates direct human influence on ecosystems using 8 measures of human presence. The 8 measures are population density per kilometer square, score of railroads, score of major roads, score of navigable rivers, score of coastlines, score of night times, stable lights values, urban polygons, and land cover categories. The values range from 0 to 64, where 0 represents no human influence and 64 represents the maximum human influence possible using all 8 measures mentioned.
We've decided to use these indices as they help explain how carbon emissions have varied over the years in locations across the world.
So now that we've learned the definitions, let's actually use the JMR software to look at how the carbon dioxide emissions have changed over a period of time in 2 different locations, the United States of America and India. So you might be wondering, why are we looking at the data of only these 2 nations? Well, that is because despite rapid advancements in the US, there are some interesting trends in Human Influence Index and Human Footprint Index that can be compared to a nation like India, which has a population of over 3 times the population of the US, a higher poverty rate, and a much lower technology advancement rate. First, let us look at the data of the country of 331 million people, the United States of America. We can compare the data of the global human footprint and the global human influence index by simply drawing lines on the graph. First, I'm going to use the global human footprint index data. So I drag a line across the country from coast to coast. And I double click this line. As you can see, there's a firm line that is formed. When I double click this part, I can see that there is a chart that is formed which shows variations in human footprint index. Now, these arise because of differences in population, difference in consumption of meat products, emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gas, and production of electronic waste. In cities where there's a high population, is usually that they're more technologically advanced and they have more infrastructure. This results in a significant waste disposal, especially in electronic gadgets. Now, most of these gadgets are either burned or disposed, but not really recycled. So that results in a huge amount of CO2 emissions to the atmosphere and other toxic gases which are emitted, which results in a high human footprint index. As you can see here, the peak here is about 85. Now, the point to remember is that the human footprint index ranges from 0 to 100. So a population of 331 million of USA with 85 as the human footprint index is still a staggering number. Now, let's move on to the human influence index. I'm going to retrace the same line. Double click on the graph, and as you can see, there's another graph that shows variations in the human influence index. The human influence index ranges from 0 to 64, with 64 being the maximum human influence, while 0 is a no human influence. There are certain places where the human influence index is as low as about 3. That is primarily because of a low population density and also for the fact that there might not be as much resources available in that area. And whilst the maximum here is close to about 56. Now, as I traverse across this graph, you can see on this graph that is close to about the region where there's quite a high population density. So that clearly shows that in places where there's a lot of resources, a lot of technologically advanced locations have a much higher human influence index and a carbon footprint index as well.
Thanks, Hari. To break down the sources of emissions, let's take a look at this chart. This chart measures greenhouse gas emissions as carbon dioxide equivalents for 2016. We see that the sector that produced the most greenhouse gases that year was the electricity and heat sector with 2.15 billion metric tons. Transportation was the second highest with 1.71 billion metric tons, and the building sector was third. Let's check in on Hari again.
Now, let's move over to the nation, which has a population of about 1.2 billion people, India. We will be specifically looking at the footprint and influence index between Delhi, which has a population of 26 million people, and Bangalore, which has a population of 12.5 million people. The population between these two cities is roughly about the population between the city in Washington and the city in Florida, which we previously mapped. We're going to follow the same process, firstly looking at the global human footprint. As you can see, the peak height of human footprint is at about 90 between Delhi and Bangalore. Comparing this to the peak in the USA, which was close to about 85, this number definitely is not that far. So it shows that despite wealth of resources, the USA, which still clocks at about 85, has lack of management of resources and overproduction and overconsumption of environmentally harmful products. Now let's make a comparison of the human influence index between these two cities and the US. Retracing the line again. As you can see, the graph now here clocks close to about 57. Now, this is pretty much the same similar value of the US, which had close to about 56. And the variations, as you can see, between Delhi and India are quite drastic, with the human influence index close to Bangalore at about 25. Now, this big difference is primarily because of a more environmentally strict policy that is being implemented in Bangalore, where e-waste is compulsory to be recycled, and there are a lot of impositions and bans on emissions of carbon dioxide, and there are quite strict rules and regulations of the operation hours of factories which produce greenhouse gases. Now, Delhi, which has one of the highest pollution levels in the world, is definitely not surprising. The fact that it's about 57, which shows that there's clearly lack of policies being implemented in the city, which has led to such a high value of human influence index. Nevertheless, comparing this value to the US, it can be seen that despite a big population difference between the two countries, there still seems to be a stark comparison in not just the influence index, but also the human footprint.
Let's now break down the sources of emissions in Hari's home country. In this chart, we see that the sector that produced the most greenhouse gases in 2016 was also the electricity and heat sector, but this time we are looking at 1.11 billion metric tons rather than 2.15 billion. The second highest emitting sector for India was agriculture with 704.16 million metric tons. The manufacturing and construction sector came in third. To know how much CO2 emissions these countries are contributing on a global scale, we see here that the US is a much darker blue when compared to India. The reason for this is because for the year 2018, the US annual share of global CO2 emissions was about 14.81%. When we click on the country, a chart pops up that is set to begin in the year 1930. Looking at more recent years, we see that the country's annual share has been decreasing over time. When we go back to India, we see that for that same year, their annual share was about 7.26%. When clicking on India, we unfortunately see a positive trend.
As promised, Genesis and I will now provide some suggestions that would help you reduce your carbon footprint. Remember, the smaller your carbon footprint, the better it is for the planet, as it has a smaller negative impact. Did you know that on average in the US, turning off the lights when you aren't in the room could keep about 268.2 pounds of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year? Crazy, right? Using a reusable shopping bag every time you go shopping could save 11 pounds of carbon dioxide a year. Drying clothes on a line rather than in a dryer could save around 440.9 pounds a year. Isn't this great? But when compared to the average carbon footprint of a person in the US, which is over 16 metric tons, we are going to have to think bigger.
Well, in this case, did you know that living car-free keeps 2.4 metric tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere annually? Not going on a flight could save up to 2.8 metric tons. Cutting out meat from your diet could roughly save about an additional ton a year. Now, I know these are big lifestyle changes, but remember, these are just some suggestions. Know that when adding lots of small changes, one can still make a big difference. Feel free to pause the video here if you want to learn more about ways you can reduce your carbon footprint. These are pre-made infographics provided by Easily, who gathered information from the World Health Organization.
If you want to calculate your own carbon footprint, check out the calculators linked down in the description box. We personally like the Global Footprint Networks calculator as it is quick and easy. Let us know how many Earths we would need if we all lived like you. Your overshoot day, break down your consumption by categories, and so much more. Check out my results. Well, I definitely need some work in reducing my own carbon footprint before we end up looking like Matt Damon in the movie The Martian. No, the change is possible. We've already seen positive changes in various parts around the world that have given many people hope. Just remember, we hold the power to make the change that can save the planet. Go out and advocate, inform others, and implement ways to reduce your own carbon footprint. Thanks
Thanks
for
for
watching.
watching.